Hey everyone, this is Oscar from Underdog, and let's talk about acid. When I say acid, what I really mean is acid house and acid techno, which are subgenres of dance music that revolve almost entirely around the sound created by one or two specific pieces of machinery. And the specific pieces of machinery that I'm talking about are the Roland TB303 bass synthesizer and the Roland TR909 drum machine. These two things that I'm holding in my hand are actually the reissues, the more modern, updated versions that Roland put out recently of these old iconic boxes. But basically all the sounds that you heard in the intro were just emulated versions of the 303 and the 909 jamming together. Especially the 303, whenever you hear that in a song, people will immediately turn to each other and say, acid. So imagine you want to make yourself some acid. Well, today I want to look with you at some of the tools that exist out there, specifically the software tools that you can use to simulate these two boxes and to make your own acid. We'll look at how to do this natively in Ableton without any plugins. We'll look at the emulations by D16 Group, the emulations by Audiorealism, and the emulations made by Roland themselves as well. There's no sponsor in this video, by the way, so all of this is just going to be based on my own experience and my own convenience when producing. Now, before we get into it, I'd like to thank everyone who responded to my question here on YouTube, asking for some of the classic, iconic acid house and acid techno songs. I've taken all of the responses and I've put them into a big Spotify playlist, which you can find in the link below. And one of the things that becomes clear when you look at a list like this is that the definition of acid is quite blurred. It means a lot of different things for a lot of different people. And almost always it revolves around this 303 bass line, but not even always. Sometimes there's other synths programmed with that same kind of 303 line philosophy behind it, but not even including the 303 or the 909. But still it sounds acid. So I'm not here to gatekeep the definition of what acid is or isn't. And in the next few videos, I'd like to explore some of the kind of subgenres of acid and make some in a kind of a full track context. So stay tuned if you're interested in seeing that happen. All right, let's hop into Ableton and start making some acid. Before we go any further, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and consider signing up for one of my video courses on courses.underdog.brussels. I have a big Foundations of Electronic Music course for beginners and a techno follow-along course for industrial techno as well. If you like these free videos, consider supporting me on Patreon as well, and come say hi on our Discord channel. Now let's get into Ableton. Okay, so what actually makes an acid synthesizer acid? Let's discuss. First of all, it's a monophonic synthesizer. It has only one voice at any given moment, and there's only one oscillator playing that voice, which is a square wave or a sawtooth wave. That one oscillator is going into a filter, and it's a very resonant filter. It's a filter that can open up and go wow in a very, very characteristic and distinct way. After that filter, sometimes it gets distorted a little bit, and then this sound is played using a sequencer that also has a couple of very characteristic things about it. First of all, almost always the sequencer runs at 16th notes, has a pattern of 16 steps or less, and per step you can turn the note on or off, you can set the pitch of the note, you can jump up an octave or down an octave, you can program accents, that's like hits with higher velocity than others. And you can program slides. Those are crucial as well because they're part of the identity of a 303 sound. So all of these things you can do in many synths. Almost every synth can do these steps. And so in Ableton, for educational reasons, let's try and do this using Ableton's operator. Okay, so in Ableton, I make myself a MIDI track and I drag onto it the analog synthesizer. The analog synthesizer might look complicated, but if you ever feel lost when looking at a synthesizer, remember the steps that I outlined in my How to Learn Any Synth video. That's where you're going to get familiar with the controls on any synthesizer. And so here, what we want is we want one oscillator right here, running into one filter right here, running into one amplifier right here. So I'm going to disable this secondary oscillator over here, and the secondary filter and amplifier are already muted. Great, we've just got that simple sequence like that. So let me play a few notes. Okay, this is a simple sawtooth wave. Perfect, that's exactly where we want to be to get started. Now I'll play it down an octave or two. Yeah, let's play it over here. And then let's bring down the filter frequency, but up the filter resonance. Oh, there we go. We're already getting into the right ballpark. And so let's have a look at the envelope that opens up this filter, because how much that envelope is going to open up the filter is going to determine how much of a bow, bow, bow sound that we're going to get. So down here in analog, you can see that there is a curve here, which is the envelope for the filter. And what I like to do is I like to make it a completely plucky envelope. So bring it all the way down. Look at the decay, maybe 300 milliseconds. That's good. And then over here is the amount at which the envelope affects the cutoff. So that's where we want to be. Awesome. So for this now, let's program in a simple sequence. Let's program in every 16th note, a simple sequence like this. Here, I'll just duplicate. And let's bump it down 2 octaves. Cool. And now let's remember from an acid sequencer, what we want to do is every now and then we want one of the notes to be up an octave or down an octave. We want some to be accented and we want some to have slide. So what I'll do is maybe I'll program in a few notes that might be interesting than nothing. So like let's program in something in a minor scale, like there we go. And let's hit play on this. Cool. Let's bump some of these up and down an octave. Cool. And now let's give some of them accents and some of them slides. So accents, what I want to do probably is select all of them and bring down the velocity a tiny little bit so that the difference between an accented note and a not accented note is going to be very clear. And then I'm going to accent some that are like on syncopated beats. So on the weak beats. So there, and maybe here, and maybe here. Let's see what this feels like. So already we can feel those notes being accented because the velocity is probably affecting the volume and the filter cutoff, because that's how most synthesizers respond to velocity. Let's have a look inside of the synthesizer. I'm doing Shift Tab to come back in. And over here, you can see the envelope to velocity is 0. Let's increase that a little bit. Yeah, not quite so far. Not bad. And in the amplifier, look, this one is quite a lot. For the amplifier, let's keep the envelope very simple. Let's make the sustain maximum and the release very, very short. Cool. Let's go look at our notes. Let's select all our notes, make them a bit shorter to make it a bit more staccato. We have to find the sweet spot here a little bit. Very nice. Very nice. This is working pretty well. And now under the drive settings, we can try out a few different filter drives. That's going to change the character of how the filter responds to the signal a little bit. As you know, a filter removes frequencies from a sound, but most filters also add a kind of a saturation or a kind of distortion to the sound, just a little bit. And so that's why some people like some filter designs more than other. So let's look at some of the other ones here. I like this one. Okay, awesome. Now let's do the slide. So for a slide, what we're probably going to need is to make this synth monophonic. So under the global section over here, we look over here how many voices there can be, and we want it to be mono. And then we're going to turn on glide. And now the problem is that it's going to glide every time that it changes pitch, but we only want it to glide sometimes. So that's why we're going to activate legato mode. And then in some of the notes, we're going to make them longer to overlap with previous notes. Like for instance, let's make this one overlap. And let's make this one overlap. Let's see what this feels like. Okay, so this took a little bit of tweaking, but we're starting to get something that sounds pretty credible. And when you tweak the filter cutoff, this is when it really feels acid, right? So without the resonance, very sawtooth-like, still cool. But then when you crank the resonance, and here it really becomes that kind of bubbly acid. So on the original unit, there was also a delay unit right behind it. So we can just add a delay here. Make sure it's not synchronized. I think that's one of the charms of the original, is totally not synchronized, so it's always a bit messy. So let's find ourselves where it kind of hits a sweet spot. Yeah, sounds pretty good. So what I'll do with this now is I'm going to group them into an instrument rack and set up a few controls, and then I'm going to make this available on my Patreon so that if you want this exact rack, you can just get it there. Of course, you can follow the settings as I did it now, but if you just want the acid sound, you can get it there, and so it's native to your Ableton. You don't need any external plugins. Alright, so next to the Ableton 303, we're also going to make an Ableton 909, which is going to be also pretty simple. We're going to make a MIDI track, and then we're going to go up here. We're going to find ourselves under drums, the 909 core kit, drag that on there, and voila, we've already got ourselves some 909 drums. We're going to program in a very simple pattern, like a 4 to the floor kick drum, maybe a clap on every backbeat, and maybe a hi-hat on every upbeat. Go. How about some close hi-hats every 16th note? And cool, so this could be a starting point for your own acid jam. Now, if you have a look at the control panel of the original, you'll see that per drum sound, there are a number of individual controls. Let me show you up close. And it used to be the case that Ableton would only trigger samples. It wouldn't allow you to shape the sound in the same way that you can shape the sound on the box. However, in the most recent Ableton versions, there are actually those tonal controls on here. And in particular, I find that on the snare drum, for instance, this is one of the most crucial sound shaping devices. Imagine I do a snare roll, for instance, which is just a kind of a pattern of a snare drum, something a little bit like this. And so what you can do here is for this snare drum, you can go in and change the tuning, the snappiness, and the tone, and that changes the character of this snare entirely. Being able to shape these sounds natively here in Ableton, for me, is pretty game-changing. I love the fact that you're able to do this. So if you go back to our previous loop, I can change, for instance, the decay of the open hi-hat and of the closed hi-hat. And of the bass drum, I can change the length or the tuning. Or the attack. So I can shape the snappiness and the feeling and the groove of these elements compared to each other, and that's a lot of sound shaping capabilities. And so you can do what we just did natively in Ableton, but there are also some plugin manufacturers who have made clones of the 303 and of the 909, so that without thinking you can immediately get into that sound world if that's something that you want to incorporate in your music. And so to do a fair comparison, I've programmed the same riff and drum pattern on all of these examples. So here they are: Ableton stock, Roland, D16, and Audiorealism. And so on Ableton stock, this is what it would sound like. Then Audiorealism's plugins called ABL3 and ADM sound like this. D16's Phoscyon and Drumazon sound like this. And Roland's 303 and 909 sound like this. So I'll play them all again side by side without talking. Okay, so these all sound quite different in quite subtle ways. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to bring all the parameters to about the same spot so that we can kind of compare how these sounds feel when they're almost trying to play the identical content. So let's have a look at them one by one. There is the Audiorealism ABL3, Acid Bassline 3, and then the ADM, which I assume stands for Audiorealism Drum Machine, maybe? Anyway, so the interface of the ABL3 is lovely. You have this classic setup, which looks just like the original, but the step sequencer on the original is really complicated and hard to do. So what they've done here is they've included a step mode where you have a very intuitive way of programming riffs inside of the synthesizer. Because right now I was sending Ableton note data into here, but what you can really do is make this thing into a groove box and have it generate its acid sequences internally, and that's super cool. Especially if you move over to this random setup where you can control the amount of randomization of each step. So you can, for instance, snap it to a scale and you can set the amount of slides and accents. Here, let me apply randomness, for example. There we go. There we go. And let's try another randomization. This is instantly super inspiring and is for me one of the most fun ways of interacting with a 303 synthesizer. So ABL3 in terms of acid synthesizer probably is my favorite one simply because of this interface. I had a bit of trouble getting it to sound alive and fat by feeding it notes from Ableton, but inside of the synth I find that it feels very solid and complete. Then the ADM drum machine is quite a versatile little drum machine that's pretty reliable, but I find its interface a little bit convoluted and I was struggling to make it do exactly what I wanted straight out of the box. That's probably up to me because I haven't spent enough time with it, but it's a very capable little drum machine that specializes in doing 808s and 909s, and you can add in your own samples as well, so that makes it a very competent little groove box. I was struggling a bit to make the sounds that came out of it sound fat and punchy though, and I don't know if that's due to my incompetence, very possibly, or if there's some features here that I'm overlooking. So in terms of sound, I'm not super in love with this, but in terms of versatility and reliability, I absolutely am. And I'll come back to that in a moment. Let's move on to the D16 plugins. D16's plugins are called Phoscyon, I can never really pronounce this, I don't really know how it's supposed to be pronounced, and Drumazon. And if you look at the interfaces, for me these are very attractive interfaces. I love what they've done with this kind of light scheme, this creamy kind of white. And in a similar way to ABL3, Phoscyon can also do its internal sequencing, which is probably the more interesting way to do it. This one has an arpeggiator inside of it as well, which opens up a lot of very cool creative opportunities as well. And it allows you to flick through presets for the sound timbre separately from the pattern program down here. So if I have the default pattern playing, then up here, I can change the timbre. And so you see that's just combinations of these buttons up here, which is a bit more complete than on the ABL3, and presets of the distortion settings. And I find that it's very fun to flick through them and jump from one point in the 303 palette to another. Some people have laughed in the past when I suggested that the 303 has like a broad palette, but I genuinely think that there's quite a bit of range if you explore all the different timbres of it like this. So this was the first 303 plugin that I fell in love with, and it still has a warm spot in my heart today, although I do really miss the sequencer and randomization control that ABL3 gives you. Now Drumazon here is an absolutely beautiful 909 simulator, and in terms of layout is probably by far my favorite one of all three. It just feels like you're loading up a 909 instantly and that you have so much control over the right parameters. It's a beautiful interface and it works really well, but only on my Windows computer. I have a MacBook M1 laptop for producing as well, and if I try to load this on that, it crashes Ableton 100% of the time. And that honestly is a fatal flaw. Stability is crucial. I don't know if it's the M1 chip that's doing it, probably I guess. So it might be updated in the future, and if it does, this is going to be my favorite drum machine of them all. But until now, I can only recommend this on my Windows computer. So let's move on to the Roland boxes. And so here are the legendary Roland versions of their own original boxes. So Roland gets a lot of credit for getting us to this point in the first place. Their iconic gear got us here, and so now they're taking this into the modern day by making these plug-in versions available of these sounds. Now, honestly, in terms of sound, I feel like they have a winner here. They have an amazing sound. Straight out of the box, I love the way the 303 sounded. I love the way the 909 sounded. Here, let's listen to them again. But funnily enough, in terms of graphic design, in terms of user interface, they lose to me to D16 and to Audiorealism on all counts. The plugins are honestly just pretty ugly, and in terms of usability, they have some fatal flaws that actually make it impossible for me to recommend these. And that hurts because I really want these to succeed. But for instance, look, if I want to load in a preset pattern here, right? Look at this. What is this for a menu? I don't know what this is or what this is supposed to do, but I can't click on anything here, so I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. Same over here. Can't do anything. I have no idea what's going on. So the preset bank for me is completely off limits. I don't know what to do about that. The same goes on the 909. No idea how to make this do anything what I would intuitively want it to do. And the other plugins I use today work out of the box, like I don't need to read the manual just to be able to load a preset. So this doesn't make sense to me. And that kind of a glitch, I could overlook it. But then there's the second big thing, which is its integration into the Roland Cloud service. This is a subscription-based service which requires a piece of software to be running on your computer at all times that's logged in to a server somewhere. It needs to be up to date, that software. Your plugins need to be up to date. Everything needs to be logged in. And only if those magical things all are in place, then when you click this plugin, will it actually work in your setup. This to me is a killer. There's been several situations where I wanted to use these plugins. I load them up and I get a message saying you are not authorized. Then I have to try and find my login details, open up some other piece of software, update that other piece of software, reopen up Ableton, log back in, try it out, make it work. This is a workflow killer. All I wanted to do was lay down a tasty asset line, but suddenly I'm updating software, I'm going to websites, reading help forums. This is completely unacceptable. I've had it when I was in the studio with an artist next to me who's giving me their valuable time, and I'm like, hey, check out this amazing Roland plugin, you're gonna love it, the sound is great. I open it up and it says, you are not authorized. And at that point I'm like, I'm sorry, but I can't use these plugins like this if they keep logging me out. I was on the road trying to prepare for this video on my MacBook, and Drumazon wouldn't work because it kept crashing, and none of the Roland stuff would work because I was offline and so I couldn't log into it. So in this situation, massive props to Audiorealism for just making plugins that work. And next to that, props to Ableton for making very plausible sounds possible within Ableton if you know what you're doing. So at the end of the day, what are my recommendations? Well, for the acid synthesizer, I would recommend either ABL3 or Phoscyon. I love them both for different reasons, but if I had to get only one, maybe ABL3 would be the one simply because of its ergonomic step sequencer and randomization capabilities. In terms of drum machines, my heart goes out to Drumazon simply for its beautiful interface and ease of use, but only if it works on your system, so verify that first before you invest in it. Otherwise, ADM is a capable little machine as well, but because I get tripped up so often by its interface, I'm probably going to reach out to Ableton's stock stuff more often than using that one. This video was recorded at the end of November 2021, and if Roland manages to address just its basic usability stuff, by making the plugins more reliable, maybe a little bit more attractive, and at least allowing me to click through some darn presets, then the actual sound of their plugins is amazing and they might win every single category here, but right now, that's just not the case. So there we go, that was my overview of the tools of Acid, the basic plugins that you need to start making acid house or acid techno. In the next few weeks, we'll actually try making a few tracks from start to finish. And until then, enjoy the Acid Classics playlist that I linked below. As I mentioned, come say hi on our Discord channel. And until next time, stay producing, be good to one another, and take care. Bye-bye.